Hello, this is Mike Burek, your host and producer of Krynytsia, The Well, a podcast series about topics of interest to the global Ukrainian community. Today is Monday, August 19th, 2024. This episode is produced for The Ukrainian Weekly, a newspaper published in English for the global Ukrainian community since 1933. My guest today is Andreas Umland, who is an analyst at the Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs, and also an associate professor of political science at the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. Welcome, Andreas. How are you today?
I'm fine. Thanks for having me, Michael. How are you?
And thank you for joining us. Can we get some educational and professional background on you?
Well, I'm from East Germany, from the city of Jena, and I grew up in East Germany and also visited the Soviet Union many times, and then studied in Leipzig, Berlin, Oxford, Cambridge, Stanford, and did PhDs on the Russian far right, on Zhirinovsky and Dugin, in history and in politics. And then I had short stints at Harvard and as a visiting lecturer at Oxford. And since 2002, I've been mainly for 20 years now at Kiev, teaching in various Kiev universities, the Shevchenko University, the Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. And since 2020, I'm at the Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies, but also based in Kiev.
Andreas, the situation with Ukrainians in Kursk region of Russia right now is very fluid. Actually, as of this morning, I read that there's a possibility that the Ukrainians may have blown up a third bridge on the Seyum River in an effort to try to slow down the logistics for the Russian army. So to start off with, can you tell us your view on what happened here? And was this incursion of the Ukrainians into Kursk region of Russia a complete surprise?
I would perhaps start with something unusual in saying that for me, this incursion is, of course, a very positive thing in many ways, but I think it's also a sign of desperation on the Ukrainian side. And I would assume or suspect that the Ukrainian leadership, both the political and the military leadership, would prefer to conduct such an offensive not in Russia and to liberate Ukrainian territories in southern and eastern Ukraine and not to actually enter Russian territory. The problem, however, is that Ukraine does not have the necessary equipment to do such an offensive. It also lacks the financial means, and the financial means here are, that is often forgotten, rather important for also for the personnel, for the number of soldiers that Ukraine has. I think one of the main reasons that Ukraine has these personnel problems is that simply the salary of the frontline soldiers is not that high. It's, as far as I know, currently around 3,000 euros. That is in Ukraine normally a decent salary, a more than decent salary, but that is frontline service. And if Ukraine had more financial resources and had, for instance, these 300 billion Russian euros that have been frozen in the EU, then it could pay its soldiers a higher, even a much higher salary, and then I think there would be actually enough frontline soldiers, and then Ukraine would not have to do such a risky and hazardous operation like the one in Kursk, and would simply, if it then also had the necessary ammunition and weaponry and technology and so on, it would simply liberate its own territories. But Ukraine does not have all that, and then it is looking simply for weak spaces, for weak links in the Russian-Ukrainian contact line, and it found this weak link in the Kursk region. And that's why it did this operation, and it has been praised for that. For instance, one of the chief German military commentators, General Freuding, has said this is exactly what you do in war. You look for weak links or weak spots in your enemy's front line, and then you take advantage of that. And Ukraine has done that, and for now, surprisingly successful, and is holding now this occupied Russian territory, and has, during the last 10 days, basically changed the whole conversation about the war, both the Ukrainian conversation and Russian conversation, and also the international conversation. And that is a good thing by itself, but it's still a risky operation. And I would still maintain that Ukraine would have actually preferred to conduct such an offensive operation on Ukrainian soil and to liberate Ukrainians, and not to invade Russia. So that is my interpretation, and we can speak now also about the implications and the possible repercussions.
And briefly, what do you think are the immediate goals of Ukraine in this military action, and are they achievable?
I think the main aim here is, of course, not to annex this area, although there is now a broad discussion in Ukraine about the historical roots of this area, that it was once Ukrainian speaking, and you could argue that perhaps at least parts of Kursk region are actually Ukrainian. But I don't think there's any aim to permanently occupy or annex this territory. So I think the main task here is to have a bargaining chip in negotiations. And for me, at the end of the day, perhaps the most interesting side in all of this are countries like China, India, Brazil, those countries who have for 2.5 years now insisted that there should be negotiations, and the negotiations should start immediately, and they should start without any preconditions. And negotiations is the way to go, and one should not wait with them. And this is now the task of the day. And that is what these countries have been preaching now for 2.5 years. And now I would actually want to see what a country like China is doing with the current situation, whether they would still insist that negotiations should be conducted immediately and should be conducted without preconditions, or whether they will succumb to the new Russian line. The new Russian line since 6th of August is there will be no negotiations as long as Ukrainian troops are on Russian legitimate state territory. So that is for me now in a way the most interesting question. The West is of course supporting that, but the West has also been supportive of Ukraine in its rejection of earlier negotiations, which amounted, in fact, simply about talks about some sort of capitulation by Ukraine. So the term for these earlier proposals by Russia was negotiation, but what Russia wanted to negotiate was the exact modus of the Ukrainian capitulation. Now we have a different situation. Now you could have actually a transactional negotiation with a deal, land for land, simply, that could be then the subject of real negotiations. And the key actor here, I think, is China at the end of the day. Will China now use its clout, its potential, its pressure potential to force the Kremlin into negotiations with Ukraine? Because now I think Ukraine is ready for negotiations, because there's now something to negotiate about.
How much territory does Ukraine currently control in the Kursk region, and have they extended this incursion to any other regions in Russia, for example, the Belgorod area?
Yeah, I mean, the information is changing by the day, and there are new developments. And the latest I've heard is that over 1,000 square kilometers are now under Ukrainian control. Over 80 settlements have been, so to say, occupied, and that there are also some operations, less massive operations going on in the Belgorod Oblast. So that is the latest situation. But as I said, this situation is actually changing by the day.
And why do you think the incursion has been so successful so far?
I think the main factor here is the Ukrainian preparation of it, the good reconnaissance, the good organization of it, and and the Russian underestimation of Ukraine, which we've seen before in 2014. We've seen that in 2022 with the attack on Kiev, or we have seen that with the liberation of large parts of the Kharkiv and Kherson region in autumn 2022, when the Russians were also not prepared for this counteroffensive. The Russians are now well positioned and well equipped and well prepared in the Donbass and in the other occupied territories of Ukraine, but they were unprepared for such an incursion into the legitimate Russian state territory, and Ukraine has simply taken advantage of that.
And do Ukraine's Western allies support their incursion into the Kursk region? And do you think restrictions could be removed on the use of long-range Western weapons for strikes on Russian territory?
I think historians will tell us when they get access to the archives whether and to which degree Western allies were informed of this operation. Apparently, many in the West were also taken by surprise. At least the public of the West was obviously taken by surprise. Whether NATO, the US, Germany, and so on knew about this in advance and whether they've supported it, we will probably only get to know after the war, when historians can, uncover all the things that now have been kept in secret by the Ukrainian leadership. And there's even information that allegedly the political leadership of Ukraine was not fully informed of the preparation of the operation by the military leadership, and there was only then a full disclosure within the Ukrainian leadership briefly before the whole operation started. This operation is now a good argument, I think, to again pose the question of delivery of long-range weaponry to Ukraine, and also for the permission to use this long-range weaponry on Russian soil. Because, we have now the gravest, so to say, violation of Russian sovereignty, Russian territorial integrity. It has already happened with the land invasion. So I think the arguments now for the non-use or for the limited use of Western weaponry on Russian territory, these arguments have, since this land invasion of Russia, become significantly weaker, and I would hope that these last restrictions are lifted and that finally Ukraine can use all of the Western weaponry on Russian soil.
Andreas, how have Russian President Vladimir Putin and his advisors and staff reacted to the Ukrainian incursion? And do you think there will be any long-term implications for Putin as a result of it?
I think the domestic political implications or repercussions were one of the motivations for the operation. Perhaps there was also on the Ukrainian side the hope that something like the Prigozhin mutiny could repeat if there are military leaders who are unhappy with the political leadership. I think it is, of course, a huge embarrassment for Putin in a whole number of ways. There has been no land invasion of Russia since 1945. The invasion is conducted by Ukraine, not by NATO. And it changes, of course, the picture of the whole war, both domestically for the Russian population. It also undermines, I think one should not underestimate the reputation of Putin in what is called the Global South, because my impression is that many countries in the so-called Global South, they have a relatively pro-Russian or at least neutral position in this war, although they may be afraid also of a fate like the one of Ukraine, because they think of Putin and of Russia as being strong. And so there seems to be a tradition, let's say, among Arab countries to support the stronger side in such a conflict. And now Putin looks weak and Russia looks weak, and it looks especially weak because it's not invaded by a NATO army, but by a non-NATO country. that has been regarded in these parts of the world as the clearly weaker in this war. So this is, I would think, a huge embarrassment. What exact repercussions this will have domestically is, of course, very difficult to predict.
Andreas, unfortunately, we're just about out of time, but I did want to ask you one final question. What do you think will happen next?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. I think the main aim now for Ukraine will be to hold the already occupied territory and to leave this scandalous, for Russia, scandalous situation in place. And as I mentioned, I would hope that now the whole issue of negotiations will come up, and Russia doesn't want to. Putin has already said that he doesn't want to negotiate. This is now something that he has earlier proposed, but is not in favor anymore. And here, I think the main role will be played by China and also perhaps by other major non-Western countries like India, Brazil. If they exert pressure now on Russia that Russia should now go to the negotiation table, that would be then perhaps a way actually out of the war.
Andreas, thank you so much for joining us today on Krynica.
Thanks for having me.
I have been speaking with Andreas Umland, who is an analyst at the Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs and an associate professor of political science at the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy in Ukraine. This episode of Krynica has been produced for the Ukrainian Weekly, a newspaper published in English for the global Ukrainian community since 1933. And I'm Mike Burek, your host and producer of Krynica. Until next time, that's all for now.